The old house was a steal. That should have been the first warning. Tucked away on a winding country road, embraced by ancient gnarled trees, it was the kind of place that belonged on a postcard from a forgotten time. For Leo, a freelance illustrator trying to escape the city's frantic pulse and the ghosts of a failed relationship, it was perfect. 2 floors, a dusty attic, a sprawling garden overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, all for a price that was almost suspiciously low. The previous owner passed away, the agent, Carol, had explained, her gaze shifting towards the warped floorboards. An elderly gentleman lived here his whole life. His family just wanted it sold quickly. Leo didn't press for details. He was too captivated by the house's rustic charm, by the way the afternoon sun streamed through the wavy, imperfect glass of the bay window, painting fractured rainbows on the dust motes dancing in the air. The first week was idyllic. The silence was a balm to his frayed nerves. He set up his studio in a spare bedroom upstairs, the one overlooking the garden. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional creak and groan of the old house settling, like a sleeping giant sighing in its slumber. It was a peaceful symphony, and for the first time in months, Leo felt himself begin to unwind. The first time it happened, he almost missed it. He was in bed, drifting on the pleasant edge of sleep, when a faint sound pulled him back. Tap. It was soft, singular, almost polite. It sounded like it came from the direction of the large, built-in wardrobe that took up most of the far wall. Leo's eyes fluttered open. He listened, holding his breath, but the house had returned to its gentle chorus of creaks and whispers. He dismissed it as his imagination, or perhaps a branch brushing against the siding, and rolled over, pulling the covers tighter. The next night it came again, tap. This time he was wide awake, reading. The sound was unmistakable. It was quiet, but sharp and clear. It wasn't the groaning of old wood or the skittering of a mouse. It was a distinct tap, like a single knuckle rapping gently against a door. And it came, without a doubt, from inside the wardrobe. A prickle of unease traced a path down his spine. He stared at the dark wood of the wardrobe doors. Slowly, he got out of bed. The floorboards were cool beneath his feet. He crossed the room, the silence amplifying the soft padding of his footsteps. He placed his hand on the cold brass handle, hesitating for a moment, then pulled the heavy door open. The wardrobe was empty, save for a few of his shirts hanging limply from the rail and the faint, musty smell of mothballs and old wood. He ran his hand along the inside of the door, along the back panel, searching for any loose boards or mechanisms that could have made the noise. He found nothing but smooth, solid oak. He closed the door, a little unnerved, and went back to bed. Old houses make strange noises, he told himself. It's normal. But the third night, the tap was louder, more insistent. Tap. This time, he was wide awake, reading. The sound was unmistakable. It was quiet, but sharp and clear. It wasn't the groaning of old wood or the skittering of a mouse. He stared at the dark wood of the wardrobe doors. He ran his hand along the inside of the door, along the back panel, searching for any loose boards or mechanisms that could have made the noise. He found nothing but smooth, solid oak. Slowly, he got out of bed. The floorboards were cool beneath his feet. He crossed the room, the silence amplifying the soft padding of his footsteps. He placed his hand on the cold brass handle, hesitating for a moment, then pulled the heavy door open. It was a distinct tap, like a single knuckle rapping gently against a door. And it came, without a doubt, from inside the wardrobe. A prickle of unease traced a path down his spine. Old houses make strange noises, he told himself. It's normal. He sat up in bed, the lamp on his nightstand casting a warm but fragile pool of light. He watched the seconds on his phone tick toward midnight. The wardrobe was empty, save for a few of his shirts hanging limply from the rail, and the faint, musty smell of mothballs and old wood. He felt like he was in a standoff with the house itself. He closed the door, a little unnerved, and went back to bed. But the third night, the tap was louder, more insistent. Tap. This time, Leo didn't flinch. He took a deep, shaky breath, and in a voice that was far from steady, he called out to the wardrobe. It arrived at the exact same moment. Leo glanced at his phone on the nightstand. 12 at midnight exactly, he felt. Foolish for a moment, talking to an empty piece of furniture. He was about to lie back down, to chalk it all up to sleep deprivation and stress, when a new sound came from the wardrobe. He didn't get out of bed this time. He just lay there, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes fixed on the wardrobe. The silence that followed was heavier, more charged than before. He felt a sense of being watched, a palpable presence in the room with him that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was barely audible, yet it filled the entire room, crawling directly into his ear with an impossible intimacy. For a week, the pattern repeated itself with maddening precision. Every night at the stroke of midnight, a single tap from within the wardrobe. It never varied. Just one tap. Leo's rational mind fought a losing battle against a primal fear that was beginning to take root. He tried sleeping with earplugs, but he could still feel the sound, a faint vibration that seemed to travel through the floor and into his bones. He thought about sleeping in the guest room, but a strange sense of stubbornness, or perhaps the fear of what might happen if he wasn't there to hear it, kept him in his own bed. On the 10th night, exhausted and on edge, he decided to confront it. 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds. 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. 12 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Tap. The sound was sharp and commanding in the silent room. Who's there? The silence that answered was absolute, so profound it seemed to drink the very air from the room. It wasn't a tap. It was a voice. A dry, faint whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. You let me in. The words hung in the airless room, not a sound, but as a stain. You let me in. For a full minute, Leo didn't move. He was a statue carved from ice, every muscle locked, his breath a stone in his chest. The whisper hadn't been a sound he heard with his ears. It was a thought that had been planted directly into his mind, cold and sharp. He felt a profound, violating intimacy with the source of that voice, as if it knew the texture of his thoughts, the rhythm of his fear. He fumbled for the doorknob behind him, his fingers clumsy and numb. He found it, turned it, and threw himself out into the hallway, slamming the bedroom door shut with a deafening bang. He stood there in the dark hall, chest heaving, listening. Then the paralysis broke. A raw animal panic took over. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped somewhere in his constricted throat. He found the real estate agent's card and dialed, his heart thumping. He scrambled backwards off the bed, stumbling, his legs tangled in the sheets. A dream. It had to have been a dream. A waking nightmare brought on by stress, isolation, and a new creaky house. You mentioned the previous owner, Mr. Blackwood. What was he like? The whisper was just his sleep-deprived brain filling in the blanks. He repeated this to himself like a mantra as he made coffee, the words feeling thinner and more hollow with each repetition. Leo tried to sound casual. Did he have any hobbies? Anything he was known for? Oh, Alistair, he was a character. Kept to himself mostly. He was a bit of an eccentric, I suppose. The neighbors used to say he was a collector, a very quiet man. Lived there his whole life, you know? Why do you ask? He fell hard onto the floorboards, the impact jarring his teeth. He didn't feel the pain. His eyes were still locked on the wardrobe, a slab of darkness that seemed to pulse in the pale lamplight. He crab-walked backward, his hands slapping against the dusty floor until his back hit the opposite wall. Silence. He didn't sleep in the room that night. He didn't sleep at all. He spent the remaining hours until dawn huddled on the living room sofa, a kitchen knife clutched in his white-knuckled hand, jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. By morning, exhaustion had brought a fragile, anemic rationality. But his hand shook, and the faces he drew all had the same wide, terrified eyes. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. He avoided the upstairs all morning. He worked downstairs, trying to lose himself in his illustrations. Around noon, he couldn't stand it anymore. He had to know more. Carol. Hi, it's Leo, the guy who bought the old Blackwood place. Leo, how are you settling in? Her voice was professionally cheerful. Good, he lied. The house is great. I was just curious. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. No reason, just curious about the history. Carol laughed, a little nervously. Hobbies? I don't know. A collector? Of what? Stamps? Coins? No, Carol said, her voice dropping slightly. Stories, and not other things. Look, Leo, it's an old house. It's bound to have history. Don't go letting your imagination run away with you. The conversation ended soon after, but her words lingered. A collector of stories. He sat with his back to the wall, a book open on his lap, and waited. He watched the clock on his phone. That evening, Leo knew he couldn't spend another night on the sofa. This was his house. He wouldn't be driven out by a nightmare. Fortified by a desperate, foolish courage, he went upstairs. He didn't open the bedroom door. Instead, he went into the spare room and dragged a heavy, solid oak dresser out into the hallway. With a grunt, he pushed it firmly against his bedroom door, blocking it completely. If something was in there, it was staying in there. He let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was his mind. It was all in his head. He had just needed to break the cycle. He felt a triumphant, foolish grin spread across his face. Feeling slightly more secure, he made a bed on the floor of his studio and turned on every light. 11:50, 11:55, 11:59. He held his breath. The house was utterly still. The moment of midnight arrived in absolute, deafening silence. No tap. Relief washed over him, so potent it made him dizzy. That's when he heard the new sound. Scrawape. Leo's blood ran cold. He was frozen again, his eyes wide, fixed on the door. The scraping stopped directly over the old-fashioned keyhole. It was a slow, deliberate sound. It wasn't in his head this time. It was a physical sound, a dry hiss of air sliding through the keyhole, carrying the same deadly voice. The sound of a single fingernail being dragged across wood. It wasn't coming from the wardrobe. It was coming from the hallway, from the other side of his studio door. Scrap up. It was moving, tracing the outline of the door frame, slow and methodical. Then the whisper came again. Such a clever boy. But you've locked the wrong door. The whisper from the keyhole vaporized the last of Leo's courage. You've locked the wrong door. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, trying to make himself as small as possible. His eyes, wide with terror, were glued to the door. The scraping had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a thinking silence. He heard that he pulled books from shelves, sending them crashing to the floor. He overturned stacks of old canvases, the smell of oil paint and turpentine filling the air. He ran his hands along the walls, under the worn-out rug, searching for anything. Sound of the dresser, the heavy oak dresser he had pushed in front of his bedroom door, being moved. It didn't scrape. It slid across the floorboards with an impossible, frictionless ease, as if it weighed nothing at all. He heard the soft click of his bedroom door opening. A predatory stillness. A correction offered by a patient teacher to a slow-learning student. Leo scrambled away from the studio door, his breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. He pressed himself into the far corner of the room, jiggle, slowly from side to side. Not with force, but with a delicate, exploratory touch. It was going back to its room, fueled by pure adrenaline. He couldn't stay here and wait for midnight to come again. He had to understand what was happening. Carol's words echoed in his mind, a collector of stories. What did that mean? This was Alistair Blackwood's house, his studio. Surely there was something here, some clue. As if a child were playing with it, Leo watched, mesmerized in horror. As the metal latch inside the keyhole slid back and forth with each turn, the lock wasn't engaged. He hadn't thought to lock it. Why would he? He was locking something in, not out. Rattle. Then a new sound. Jiggle. The old brass doorknob was turning. He had trapped himself. His gaze darted around the room, frantically searching for an escape. The single window looked out over the back garden 2 stories down. The doorknob was still. Leo held his breath, straining to hear. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, then another moving away from the door. Was it leaving? A sliver of hope, fragile and foolish, pierced through his terror. A thick, gnarled branch of an ancient oak tree scraped against the glass, but it was too high, too far to risk the jump. He was boxed in, the rattling stopped, then it wasn't leaving. Leo's mind raced. He began to tear the room apart. He wasn't quiet. His frantic search was a loud, desperate cacophony. His fingers brushed against a loose floorboard near the hearth. His heart leaped. With trembling hands, he pried at the edge of the board. It came up with a low groan. And there, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated over 50 years ago. And in my youthful arrogance, I answered it. I challenged it. And in doing so, his eyes flying across Alistair Blackwood's private terror. The old man didn't call it a ghost. He called it the listener, or the midnight man. It didn't want to kill or possess. It wanted to feed. The last few entries were written as spidery, almost illegible scrawl. I issued the invitation. It knows the ending is near and its hunger is great. I fear it will not leave with me. I have left the door open for the next tenant, the next tale. God forgive me. It was worn smooth with age and use. The cover was blank. He snatched it up and flipped it open. The pages were filled with a cramped, spidery handwriting. It wasn't a keyhole. It was a peephole. Your story. He had unknowingly said, "Tell me your story." And the entity had replied, "No, first, you tell me yours." It learns you from the inside out. It wants to know your hopes, your regrets, your secrets. It wants to watch your life unfold until the very last page is written. It is a collector. It has begun the first entry read. I was a fool. I heard the tap. Leo's blood ran cold. He devoured the pages. It feeds on fear, Alistair wrote, but that is just the appetizer. The main course is the story. But Leo knew it wasn't over. It was just waiting for the next chapter of his story to begin. And as he looked at the studio door, he noticed something he hadn't before. Leo felt sick. The tapping wasn't a haunting, it was an audition. By asking who's there, he flipped towards the end of the journal, his hands shaking so violently he could barely read. My story is almost over. I am old and the pages are thin. The listener has grown impatient. The very last entry was just 3 words written in a shaky, final hand. Don't be alone. A loud bang from his bedroom across the hall made Leo cry out, dropping the journal. It was the sound of the wardrobe door being thrown open with immense force. He sat frozen on the floor, the dead man's words echoing in his ears. The house fell silent again. In the center of the door, at eye level, was a small circular hole that had been plugged with a cork. And from the other side, the cork began to push slowly inward. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into a painful eternity. Leo watched the cork, a tiny plug holding back an ocean of dread. It moved with an unnerving smoothness, not popping out, but being deliberately eased from its position. a perfect black void in the center of the door. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. He was a mouse in a box, and the cat was peering in. His breath hitched. His world had shrunk to that single point of focus, the slow, inexorable emergence of the cork. With a final, soft pop, it fell to the floor in the hallway. For a moment, there was nothing but the small, dark circle of the empty peephole. He couldn't move. His feet were nailed to the floor. The peephole was an eye that saw into his soul, a malevolent vortex that promised to pull him into the darkness on the other side. He expected to see darkness, or perhaps the patterned wallpaper of the hallway. He could feel it watching him, feel its cold, ancient attention focused entirely on him. He would smash the window, climb onto the sill, and leap for the branch. He had to commit, no hesitation. He froze, his arms still raised. He shouldn't have looked. He knew he shouldn't have looked, but he couldn't stop himself. Alone, he would be consumed. Alone, his story would be devoured, page by page, until nothing was left. He needed to get out. Not just out of the room, but out of the house. Then, the last words from Alistair Blackwood's journal blazed in his mind, cutting through the fog of terror. Don't be alone. It was a stupid, reckless idea. The branch was at least 5 feet away from the window. He could fall. He could break his neck. But as he glanced back at the peephole, he knew a broken bone was infinitely better than the fate that awaited him inside this house. It was a command, a warning from a man who had failed. His panic gaze snapped to the window. 2 stories down, the thick, gnarled branch of the old oak tree was his only chance. Decision made. A surge of desperate energy flooded his limbs. He had to be fast. He grabbed a heavy sketchbook from the floor, his mind calculating the trajectory. He took a step towards the window, raising the sketchbook. But as he moved, a flicker of motion in the peephole caught his eye. He lowered his head, inch by agonizing inch, until his own eye was level with the hole. Instead, he saw an eye looking back. It wasn't human. It was a vast, milky orb that filled the entire peephole, like a planet seen through a telescope. It had no iris, no pupil, just a swirling, pearlescent surface like the inside of a seashell. It was ancient and unblinking. And as Leo stared into it, he felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if he were falling into its bottomless depths. He saw things on that swirling surface. Images flickered, too fast to comprehend, but leaving behind the residue of their meaning. He fell against a stack of canvases, sending them clattering to the floor. He saw himself signing the papers for the house, his own signature a black scrawl on the page. He saw himself laughing with his ex-girlfriend in a sunlit park, a memory he cherished. He saw himself as a small child, crying over a scraped knee. It was showing him his own story. Leo recoiled, stumbling backward with a choked cry. The connection broke. A perfect, horrifying mirror that reflected his own soul back at him. The thing at the door knew him. It had been listening not just for the past few weeks, but for his entire life. The tapping, the whispers, that was just the prelude. Now it was watching. Now it was showing him that it knew everything. There were no secrets. Not the dry whisper from before, but a new voice, echoing in his mind with perfect clarity. It wasn't Alistair's voice, it was his own. It was Leo's voice, speaking his deepest, most private thought at that exact moment. A new sound came from the door, a soft, wet noise. The sound of that massive eye blinking, and then a voice. The branch is my only hope. It had plucked the thought right out of his head. It wasn't just a collector anymore. It was a mirror. He was trapped between 2 impossible choices, a certain fall from a high window, or facing the entity on the other side of the door that wore his own thoughts like a mask. The reflected thought, his own desperate voice in his own mind, was a hook that pinned Leo to the floor. The branch is my only hope. Then more thoughts came, unbidden but spoken in his own internal voice. They blossomed in the silence, cold and sharp. You'll never make it. It's too far. You'll slip. Your hands are shaking too much. They will find you broken on the ground in the morning. Another tragic story for the old house. Every flicker of doubt, every logical assessment of the risk was twisted into a weapon and turned against him. The branch was a dark, skeletal arm reaching for him against a cloudy sky. But Alistair's warning wasn't about company. It was about sanctuary. Don't be alone in your head. That was the real prison. That was its hunting ground. It was a sound stripped of language and thought, a blast of pure, unreasoning defiance. It was the only secret he had left. It seemed impossibly distant. The eye in the door watched him, patient and serene. It was savoring this moment, the delicious paralysis of its prey. If he couldn't outthink it, he would have to not think at all. He had to become a creature of pure instinct, an action without a prologue, a scream without a word. To think was to feed it. To plan was to hand it the blueprint of his own defeat. For a split second, the world was a kaleidoscope of reflecting moonlight on glass, the dark shape of the oak tree, and the pinprick of the watching eye in the door behind him. The collector didn't just want his story. It wanted to write the final, miserable chapter itself. The entity wasn't just listening. It was authoring his despair, using his own fear as ink. He looked from the damning peephole to the window. Don't be alone, the journal had said. He was alone, utterly. A new kind of resolve, born not of courage, but of pure, cornered animal fury, ignited in his chest. Leo opened his mouth and let out a raw, guttural roar. In the same instant, he moved. He didn't run. He launched himself across the room. He didn't aim the sketchbook. He threw his entire body at the window. The crash was an explosion of sound. The window shattered inwards, shards of glass scattering across the floor like frozen rain. The cold night air slapped him in the face, a shocking, clean gasp after the stale air of the studio. The house fell away beneath him. He saw the dark, wet lawn rushing up to meet him. His arms flailed, his fingers clawing at the empty air. He didn't pause on the sill. His feet found the edge for a microsecond, the splintered wood digging into his socks. There was nothing, just the sickening, weightless sensation of falling. And then he was gone. He leaped out into the blackness, a blind, desperate launch into the void. The world tilted violently. For a terrifying moment, his feet kicking at nothing, his entire body weight held by one straining, screaming arm, he was alive. Gasping, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. He risked a glance back at the house. He had made it. It wasn't angry. It wasn't surprised. It just watched him, its unblinking gaze filled with an ancient, terrifying patience. His outstretched hand hit something solid. Then, his fingers clamped down with painful force. A shower of leaves and bark rained down past his face. His arm was nearly wrenched from its socket as his momentum was brutally halted. He swung wildly, his body slamming into the thick, unforgiving trunk of the oak tree. The impact knocked the wind out of him in a pained grunt. He was dangling. He hung there for a second. In the jagged, black hole of the window he had just created, the milky, planetary eye was still there. It knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just a turn of the page,